The alkali dust was a fine, white powder that coated everything. It settled in the folds of Eleanor's gray traveling dress, worked its way into the tightly bound bun at the nape of her neck, and left a gritty film on her tongue. For 3 days, she had sat on a hard plank bench in the back of a freight wagon, watching the vast, unforgiving plains of Wyoming unspool before her. The world swayed with the lumbering gait of the mules, a ceaseless, jarring rhythm that she felt deep in her bones. It was the only rhythm she had. She clutched the letter in her lap, the paper worn soft and limp from countless readings. The ink had faded, but she knew the words by heart. They were a simple, stark promise, penned by a man she had never met. I have a good ranch. I need a wife. I'm told you are a decent woman. I will provide for you and treat you with respect, if this is agreeable. The ticket is enclosed. Cole Harland. Respect. The word was a balm on a wound that had festered for years. It was a promise of something more than the pitying glances and charitable condescension that had been her daily bread since the silence fell. In her small room at the orphanage, she had read those words under the thin light of a kerosene lamp, and for the first time in a long time, she had allowed a fragile tendril of hope to unfurl within her chest. A husband, a home, a new beginning where no one knew the girl she used to be, the one who could hear the birds sing. The relentless motion of the wagon was a cradle for memory, rocking her back to a time before the silence. She remembered the scratchy wool of her father's coat against her cheek and the low rumble of his voice, a vibration she could feel in his chest long after the sound of it was lost to her. She remembered the sweet, lilting melody of her mother singing a lullaby, a tune that now existed only as a ghost in her mind, a shape without substance. They had been taken by influenza when she was 10, leaving her in the cold, starched care of the St. Jude's Home for Children. Even then, in her grief, the world had been full of sound, the clang of the dinner bell, the hollow echo of footsteps in the long dormitory, the whispers of the other girls in the dark. Then, at 12, the fever came. It arrived like a thief, stealing the warmth from her limbs and filling her head with a roaring fire. She remembered the heat, the sweat-soaked sheets, the pressure building behind her eyes. For weeks, she drifted in a murky twilight, tethered to the world by the cool touch of a wet cloth on her forehead. When the fever finally broke, it took something with it. The first thing she noticed was the quiet, not a peaceful quiet, but a profound and terrifying emptiness. The doctor, a man with a kind face and a thick mustache, stood by her bed, his mouth moving. She saw the shape of his words, the concern etched around his eyes, but the sounds were gone, as if a thick pane of glass had been lowered between her and the rest of the world. She had screamed then, a raw, desperate sound she could feel tearing from her own throat but could not hear. The sound of her own voice had been stolen along with everything else. The world had been muted, its vibrant symphony replaced by a dull, constant hum inside her own head. Scarlet fever. They wrote on a slate for her to read. It had taken her hearing. It had turned her into an island. The wagon lurched to a halt, the sudden stillness a shock after days of movement. Eleanor blinked, pulling herself from the phantom world of the past. The driver, a leathery old man named Silas, twisted in his seat and grunted, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. He did not look at her when he mouthed the words. Clearwater Ridge. Eleanor gathered her small satchel and her courage, her gaze sweeping over the town. It was little more than a single dusty street flanked by raw, unpainted wooden buildings. A general store, a blacksmith, a livery stable, and, directly in front of them, a saloon with swinging doors. Several men loitered on the saloon's porch, their hats tipped low, their faces shadowed. They stopped talking as she looked their way, their attention snagged by the sight of the lone woman in the back of the freight wagon. She did not need to hear to understand. She had seen their expressions 1,000 times before, the initial curiosity, the flicker of appraisal, and then the slow, dawning smirk of mockery. One of them, a heavy-set man with a stained vest, nudged his companion and spoke behind his hand. The other man laughed, a harsh, open-mouthed bray that made his shoulders shake. Eleanor felt the vibration of it through the wagon bed, a low, ugly tremor that traveled up her spine. She saw the shape of the words on their lips as they passed them back and forth. Deaf, the mail-order bride, Harlan's deaf bride. A flush of shame crept up her neck, hot and prickly. She lowered her gaze to her hands, twisting the fabric of her skirt. She wanted to be invisible, to shrink into the rough-sawn planks of the wagon and disappear. This was a mistake. The hope that had sustained her across 1,000 miles of desolate prairie shriveled into a cold, hard knot of fear in her stomach. Then a shadow fell over her. She looked up and saw him. Cole Harlan stood beside the wagon, and he was nothing like she had imagined. The man in her mind had been a vague outline, a simple rancher. The man before her was a mountain. He was tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the harsh afternoon sun. His face was weathered, carved from granite and tanned to the color of old leather by years of sun and wind. A thick, dark mustache covered his upper lip, and his eyes, a startlingly pale gray, were recessed under a heavy brow. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and said too little. Old scars, faint white lines from a life of hard work, or perhaps something worse, marked his knuckles and one side of his jaw. He was not a man of simple promises. He was a man of silent, complicated history. He looked from the men on the porch to her, his expression unreadable. The laughter on the porch died in their throats, strangled by his presence. He held their gaze for a long moment, a silent assertion of authority that needed no words. Then he turned back to Eleanor. He gave her a single, sharp nod of greeting. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. A flicker of frustration, of uncertainty, crossed his features. How did one greet a wife who could not hear her own name? He settled for a gesture, extending a large, calloused hand toward her. Eleanor hesitated for a moment before placing her hand in his. His grip was firm, enveloping her smaller hand completely. There was no softness in it, but there was a steady strength that was oddly reassuring. With one smooth, effortless motion, he helped her down from the wagon. Her feet touched the solid ground, and she felt unsteady, her legs accustomed to the sway of the journey. She stumbled slightly, and his hand shot out to steady her, his fingers gripping her arm. He let go as soon as she found her balance, but not before he noticed the layer of white dust that now marred the sleeve of her dress. With a surprisingly gentle motion, he brushed the dust away with the back of his fingers. The gesture was brief, impersonal, yet it felt intensely protective. It was an act of ownership, a silent declaration to the watching town that she was his responsibility now. Silas tossed her small trunk from the wagon onto the street with a thud. Cole Harlan paid the man. The transaction conducted with a few grunts and a nod. Then he loaded her trunk into a buckboard waiting nearby and turned to her, motioning for her to climb up. As they rode out of town, the stares of the men on the porch followed them like a physical weight. She could feel their amusement, their pity, their contempt. She kept her head high, her back straight, but inside, she was trembling. The humiliation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She risked a glance at the man beside her. He stared straight ahead, his jaw set, his hands firm on the reins. He seemed carved from the very rock and dust of the landscape around them. Yet, as they cleared the last of the town's buildings, she saw his gaze soften for just a second as it flickered toward her. It was not a look of pity, but of something else. A quiet, troubled assessment. In that fleeting glance, she saw not the hardness of a stranger, but the weariness of a fellow soul acquainted with solitude. The ride to the ranch was long and silent. The land stretched out in every direction, a vast, rolling sea of brown grass and sagebrush under an immense, empty sky. There were no trees, no gentle hills, just the endless, wind-scoured plains. It was a land that did not offer comfort. It demanded resilience. Finally, she saw it. The Harland Ranch was a collection of stark, weathered buildings hunkered low against the prairie, as if bracing for a constant gale. A simple one-story ranch house, a large barn, and a few smaller outbuildings were enclosed by a perimeter of barbed wire that glinted in the dying sun. The wire was a stark, menacing line drawn against the wilderness, a symbol of a fierce and lonely battle to tame this place. As they drew closer, the wind picked up, a mournful sigh that swept across the plains, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant rain. Two men emerged from the barn as the buckboard pulled up. One was older, with a fringe of gray hair ringing a bald head, and the other was a young man, barely out of his teens, with a shock of sandy hair. They stopped and stared, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and unease. Cole Harland pulled the horses to a halt and set the brake. "This is Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble she felt more than heard. He did not look at her as he spoke, but at his men. "She'll be staying." He was introducing his wife as if she were a new piece of equipment. The older man, who Cole called Jed, simply touched the brim of his hat and nodded, his eyes shifting away uncomfortably. The younger one, Billy, just gawked, his mouth slightly agape, until a sharp look from Cole made him duck his head and mumble something that was lost on the wind. They exchanged uncertain looks, the silent question hanging in the air between them. What are we supposed to do with a deaf woman? Cole unloaded her trunk and carried it into the house as if it weighed nothing. He set it down in the main room, which served as a kitchen and living space. It was a sparse, masculine room, dominated by a large stone hearth and a long wooden table. Everything was functional, clean, but devoid of any warmth or personal touch. It was the home of a man who did not expect company. He led her to a small room off the main one. It contained a narrow bed with a simple quilt, a small wooden washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the endless expanse of the prairie. This was to be her room, her home. That evening, they ate in the dim light of a single lantern. Jed and Billy had taken their food to the bunkhouse, leaving Eleanor alone with her new husband. The silence in the room was a living thing, thick and heavy between them. He ate with a focused intensity, as if the simple act of eating were a task to be completed. She could barely swallow the stew he had ladled into her bowl, the knot of fear and loneliness still tight in her stomach. She needed to say something, to bridge the silent chasm between them. She reached into her satchel and pulled out a small, worn slate and a piece of chalk. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote, the chalk scratching softly against the dark surface. "Thank you for bringing me here." She pushed the slate across the table toward him. He stopped eating and looked down at it. He stared at her neat, careful handwriting for a long time, his face a mask in the flickering lamplight. She watched him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw the muscles in his jaw work as he read the simple words over and over. What was he thinking? Did he regret this already? Did he see her as nothing more than a burden, a foolish mistake? Finally, he looked up from the slate, his pale gray eyes meeting hers across the table. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, and though she could not hear the sound, she read the words clearly on his lips. "You don't owe me thanks." He pushed the slate back toward her and returned to his meal, his expression closed once more. His words were not unkind, but they were not welcoming either. They were a simple, brutal statement of fact. This was a transaction, a bargain struck out of necessity. Gratitude had no place in it. Later, in the darkness of her new room, Eleanor lay perfectly still, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the house settling around her. The reality of her situation crashed down upon her with the weight of a physical blow. She had traded one form of isolation for another, an institution filled with the noise of others for a desolate ranch ruled by a silence deeper than her own. A single tear escaped and traced a cold path down her temple into her hair, then another, and another. She pressed her face into the thin, lumpy pillow, muffling the silent, racking sobs that shook her body. She cried for the girl who could hear the rain, for the woman who had dared to hope for a home, and for the bride who had been met with laughter and a husband made of stone. Outside, a coyote lifted its head to the moonless sky and let out a long, keening cry. Its lonely call was answered by another, and then another, a mournful chorus that echoed across the vast, dark plains. The sound swept over the small ranch house, a perfect, piercing symbol of the wild and aching loneliness of the West. Eleanor could not hear it, but she felt it. She felt it in the very soul of the land she had just been delivered to. The days on the Harland Ranch fell into a rhythm dictated by the sun. Life was a relentless cycle of chores that began in the pre-dawn chill and ended long after dusk had bled the color from the sky. For Eleanor, it was a world of learning through sight and touch. She watched Jed's gnarled hands work a teat, then mimicked the motion, feeling the warmth of the cow's flank against her forehead, the rhythmic pull and the surprising strength required. She learned the distinct feel of a horse's velvety nose as it nudged her for an apple, the weight of a full bucket of water, the searing heat of the wood stove. She cooked for the men, following recipes from a worn book of her mother's, her sense of smell and timing her only guides. The ranch hands, Jed and Billy, treated her with a wary distance. They spoke about her when they thought she was not looking, their mouths forming the words she saw too often: the deaf woman. Their whispers were not always cruel, more born of a clumsy uncertainty. They did not know how to exist around her silence. Billy would sometimes start to speak to her out of habit, then catch himself, a flush of red creeping up his neck. Jed was more practical, communicating with pointed fingers and exaggerated gestures that were efficient, if not elegant. Eleanor accepted their awkwardness as she had accepted so much else, with a quiet, uncomplaining grace. She was a ghost in her own home, a silent presence at the edge of their lives. Cole worked from sunup to sundown, a tireless force of nature. He was a man who seemed more comfortable in the company of horses and cattle than of people. He spent his days mending fences, breaking wild horses, and riding the vast expanse of his land, his face perpetually turned toward the horizon. He rarely spoke to Eleanor, their interactions limited to a nod in the morning and a shared, silent table in the evening. He was trying, she knew, not to care what the town of Clearwater Ridge said about his strange marriage. He had made a practical decision, and he would live with it, his pride a fortress around his heart. But he watched her, when he sat on the porch in the evenings, mending a piece of tack. He would watch her as she stood by the fence line, her gaze fixed on the setting sun. She never seemed to feel the weight of the immense, empty landscape. Instead, she seemed to draw a kind of peace from it, as if its vast silence matched her own. He watched her hands as she kneaded dough or tended the small vegetable patch she had started near the house. They were never still, her fingers moving with a fluid, expressive grace. They were like a soft language he did not understand, but found himself wanting to learn. He saw the resilience in the set of her shoulders and the intelligence in her quick, observant eyes. He had married her for practical reasons, a wife to run his house, but he was beginning to see the woman, and he did not know what to do with that knowledge. A month after her arrival, the need for supplies forced them into town. The ride in the buckboard was as silent as the first one, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer the tense, brittle quiet of two complete strangers. It was a shared quiet, filled with the rumble of the wheels and the jingle of the harness, a space that they occupied together. Eleanor found herself less afraid of him. His presence, which had once seemed so imposing, now felt like a shield. Clearwater Ridge was just as she remembered it, dusty, raw, and judgmental. As she stepped down from the buckboard, she could feel the eyes of the town upon her. Whispers bloomed on the porches like poisonous weeds. Cole seemed not to notice, or perhaps he chose to ignore it. He tied the horses to the hitching post in front of the general store. "I need to see the blacksmith," he said, his words clear on his lips. "Stay here. Get what we need." He handed her a small list and a leather pouch of coins, then turned and walked down the street, his long-legged stride eating up the distance. Eleanor clutched the pouch and took a deep breath before pushing open the door to the store. A small bell tinkled overhead, a sound she could not hear but felt as a faint vibration through the doorframe. The store was a cluttered cavern of scents: coffee, leather, salt pork, and dust. A few women stood gossiping by a barrel of pickles, and they fell silent the moment she entered, their eyes following her with avid curiosity. The shopkeeper, Mr. Gable, a portly man with thinning hair and small, shrewd eyes, stood behind the counter. She moved through the narrow aisles, her eyes on the list in her hand. Flour, sugar, coffee, salt, beans. She gathered the items, acutely aware of the silence in the store, a silence that was entirely for her benefit. She could feel their stares on her back, hot and prickling. As she turned a corner, her hip brushed against a precarious tower of tinned peaches. The display wobbled for a heart-stopping second before crashing to the floor with a series of loud, echoing clangs. Every head in the store snapped toward her. The peaches rolled in every direction, their bright labels a stark accusation against the dusty floorboards. Eleanor froze, her face flooding with color. A ripple of snickering started near the pickle barrel. One of the women covered her mouth, her eyes crinkling with cruel amusement. Mr. Gable bustled out from behind the counter, his face a mask of theatrical exasperation. He looked at Eleanor, then at the mess on the floor. He bent down, picked up a tin, and then looked back at her. He began to speak, his mouth forming slow, exaggerated words, as if she were a simple-minded child. "Look at the mess you made." He was mocking her. The snickering from the women grew into open laughter. One of them began to imitate her, putting her hands over her ears and shaking her head in a pantomime of deafness. The humiliation was a physical blow. Stealing the air from her lungs, she wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She could only stand there, trapped in a spotlight of ridicule, her world a silent movie of jeering faces and contorted, laughing mouths. "That's enough." The voice cut through the air like a whip crack. Eleanor did not hear it, but she felt it. The laughter choked and died. The smirks vanished. Every person in the store turned toward the doorway, their expressions frozen in surprise and fear. Cole Harland stood there, filling the entrance. The sun behind him cast him in silhouette, making him seem even larger, a figure of dark, coiled fury. His pale gray eyes swept over the scene, the scattered tins, the laughing women, the sneering shopkeeper, and finally, Eleanor, standing small and stricken in the middle of it all. His face was a thundercloud. He took 2 slow steps into the room. The floorboards groaned under his weight. No one moved. No one breathed. His gaze landed on Mr. Gable, who was still holding a tin of peaches, his mouth hanging slightly open. "She is my wife," Cole said, and the quiet authority in his stance gave the words the force of a physical impact. He looked from Gable to the women, his eyes chips of ice. "You will treat her with more respect than any of you treat yourselves." His words hung in the dead quiet of the room. It was not a request. It was an order, backed by a threat that needed no articulation. The women suddenly found the floor fascinating. "Mr." Gable swallowed hard and began to stammer, mouthing apologies that no one was interested in. Cole walked past them all and stopped in front of Eleanor. He looked down at her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. He reached out and gently took the list from her trembling fingers. He handed it and the coin pouch to the shopkeeper. "Add the peaches," he said, his voice flat and cold. "Put it on my account." Without another word, he placed a hand on the small of Eleanor's back and guided her out of the store. leaving the townspeople standing in the wreckage of their own cruelty. The ride back to the ranch was thick with a new kind of silence. Eleanor stared at her hands, the scene from the store replaying in her mind, the sting of it still fresh. She was grateful for his defense, so fiercely grateful it hurt, but she was also ashamed. She was the cause of his trouble, a burden he had to publicly claim and defend. That night, she could not eat. She sat by the window in her small room, watching the stars begin to prick the deep indigo of the sky. Tears she had refused to shed in town now tracked silently down her cheeks. A soft vibration on the floor announced his presence. She turned to see him standing in her doorway. He held 2 steaming mugs in his hands. He walked into the room and held one out to her. She took it, the warmth of the ceramic a small comfort against her cold fingers. It was tea, sweet with honey. He did not leave, but stood there awkwardly, a large, uncertain presence in her small space. He looked at her tear-streaked face, and a look of profound frustration crossed his features. He wanted to say something, to offer some comfort, but words were useless between them. He set his own mug down on the washstand. Then he did something that stunned her. He lifted his rough, calloused hand, the one that knew only the feel of reins and rope and iron. He hesitated for a moment. Then slowly, clumsily, he curled his fingers into a loose fist. Extending his thumb and his little finger, he moved the hand in a small, questioning, back-and-forth motion. Eleanor stared at the gesture, her breath catching in her throat. It was a crude approximation of a sign she had tried to teach one of the girls at the orphanage years ago. A simple sign, a question, okay? It was the single most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He was trying to enter her world, to cross the silent divide that separated them. He was speaking her language, or at least, he was trying. The tears that had been born of humiliation now transformed into tears of a different kind altogether. A wave of emotion so powerful, it felt like a physical blow washed over her. She looked up at him, her eyes shining, and she nodded, a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes, I am okay." He held her gaze for a long moment, and, for the first time, the silence between them was not an emptiness. It was a space filled with a fragile, burgeoning warmth. A current of understanding passed between them, a connection forged not with words, but with a simple, clumsy gesture in the dark. A week later, the sky turned a bruised, greenish yellow. The air grew heavy and still, charged with an oppressive energy. A storm was coming. Cole and his men worked frantically to secure the livestock, their movements hurried and tense. Eleanor watched from the porch, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She had seen storms on the plains before, and they were things of terrifying, violent beauty. The first crack of thunder was a deep, jarring vibration that shook the house to its foundations. Then the heavens opened. Rain did not fall. It came down in solid, wind-driven sheets, turning the world outside the window into a gray, blurry chaos. The wind howled, a sound she could not hear but could feel in the rattling of the window panes. Suddenly, Cole burst through the door, soaked to the skin, his face grim. "The north fence is down," he yelled to Jed. "Cattle are scattering toward the ravine." Jed and Billy grabbed slickers and ran out into the maelstrom. Cole was about to follow when he saw Eleanor standing there, her face pale with worry. He pointed a finger at her. "Stay inside," he mouthed, his expression severe, before turning and plunging back into the storm. She watched him go, her heart pounding. She could not just stand here, safe and dry, while he and his men fought the storm. This was her home now, her life. Their struggle was her struggle. Without a second thought, she grabbed an old oilcloth coat from a peg by the door and ran out into the rain. The force of the wind and rain nearly knocked her off her feet. The world was a churning fury of water and noise she could feel through the soles of her boots. She could barely see more than a few feet in front of her. She spotted the flickering light of a lantern and ran toward it, her boots sinking into the thick, sucking mud. It was chaos. Horses screamed, their eyes wide with terror. Cattle, dark shapes in the deluge, bolted in every direction. Cole was on his horse, a powerful silhouette against the storm, trying to turn the panicked herd away from the dangerous drop of the ravine. Eleanor did not hesitate. She ran toward a small group of calves that had been separated from their mothers, waving her arms to drive them back toward the relative safety of the barn. The rain plastered her hair to her face and streamed into her eyes. The ground was treacherous, a slick sheet of mud. As she turned a panicked steer, her foot slipped. She cried out, a sound swallowed by the wind, as she fell backward. She braced for the impact of the cold, hard ground, but it never came. Two strong arms wrapped around her, catching her and pulling her back against a solid wall of a chest. It was Cole. He had seen her fall and had vaulted from his horse in an instant. He held her tight against him, his body shielding hers from the driving rain. For a moment, they just stood there, suspended in the heart of the storm, the chaos raging around them. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her back, or perhaps it was her own. He turned her around to face him, his hands gripping her shoulders. His face was inches from hers, his hair plastered to his forehead, rain dripping from his chin. His expression was a mixture of fury and something else she could not name. Lightning split the sky, a brilliant, blinding flash that bleached the world white for a second. In that stark, ethereal light, their eyes met. She saw the raw concern in his, the fear he felt not for his cattle, but for her. He was shouting something at her, his mouth forming words lost to the storm. She could not understand him. Instinctively, she lifted a trembling, muddy hand and touched his face. Her fingers, surprisingly gentle, traced the shape of his lips as he spoke, her touch a desperate attempt to see, to feel, to understand his words in the tumult. His shouting stopped. Her touch seemed to startle him into stillness. He looked down at her hand on his mouth, then back into her eyes. The fury in his expression melted away, replaced by a look of raw, unguarded wonder. He leaned closer, his voice no longer a shout, but a whisper she could read clearly even in the flickering gloom. "You're stronger than any of them." And then he smiled. It was not a big smile. It was a small, slow curve of his lips, a slight crinkling at the corners of his eyes. But it was there. It was the first time he had ever truly smiled at her, and it was like the sun breaking through the storm clouds. In that one, fleeting moment, in the heart of the wind and the rain, a wall he had spent years building came crashing down. The storm that had broken over the plains broke something open between them as well. In the weeks that followed, the silence that had once been a barrier became a canvas. The awkward, hesitant gestures transformed into a language all their own. It began in the evenings. After the work was done, Eleanor would show him a sign, her hands moving with a dancer's grace in the lamplight. First, the simple things. She would tap her thumb to her temple and then flatten her hand, the sign for horse. She would make a fist and bring it to her mouth, her thumb extended, for water. Cole was a clumsy student. His hands, thick with calluses and accustomed to the brute force of ranch work, struggled to form the delicate shapes. He would try to mimic her, his brow furrowed in concentration, and more often than not, his attempt would be a misshapen, comical version of her own. The first time he tried the sign for chicken and instead made something that looked more like a flailing fish. A genuine, unbidden laugh escaped her. It was a silent laugh, a shaking of her shoulders and a crinkling of her eyes, but it was pure joy. Seeing it, a slow, grudging smile touched Cole's own lips, and in that shared moment of silent amusement, the vast, lonely ranch house began to feel like a home. Their quiet companionship settled over the ranch like a gentle snow. He started looking for her as he rode in from the plains, his eyes scanning the horizon for the sight of her in the garden or walking near the fence line. She would wait for him on the porch, a glass of cool water ready. and he would accept it with a nod that was no longer just a greeting, but a genuine thanks. They moved around each other in the kitchen with an easy, practiced rhythm. Two people who had learned the cadence of the other's presence. The ranch was no longer just his, it was theirs. But beyond the barbed wire fence of their quiet world, the town of Clearwater Ridge continued to whisper. The story of Cole's defense of Eleanor in the general store had grown with each telling, cementing their reputation as the town's strangest couple. The men in the saloon would sneer into their whiskey, claiming Cole Harland had gone soft, marrying a broken woman out of some misplaced sense of pity. He must be desperate, they said, to shackle himself to a deaf mute. The women, in their sewing circles and over tea, had a different brand of cruelty. They whispered that Eleanor was unnatural, that her silence was a curse she had brought upon the Harland ranch. They watched her with a mixture of fear and scorn whenever she had to ride into town. Eleanor was aware of the rumors. She saw them in the averted eyes, the tight-lipped expressions, the way mothers would pull their children closer as she passed. The gossip was a constant, low-grade poison, but within the sanctuary of the ranch, with Cole, she felt safe from it. One week in early autumn, Cole had to take a small herd of cattle to a railhead 2 days' ride away. Jed went with him, leaving Eleanor at the ranch with only young Billy for help and protection. The first day passed peacefully, the familiar rhythm of the chores a comfort in Cole's absence. But as dusk settled on the second day, a rider approached. It was not Cole. It was Frank Tully, their nearest neighbor, a man whose property bordered theirs to the south and whose reputation for drunkenness and cruelty was known throughout the county. Eleanor was feeding the chickens when she saw him ride up, his horse weaving unsteadily. Billy, who was mending a harness near the barn, saw him too and straightened up, his young face tight with apprehension. Tully dismounted, stumbling slightly, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in one hand, his eyes, small and bloodshot, fixed on Eleanor. A slow, ugly smirk spread across his face. He swaggered toward her, his boots kicking up dust. "Well, look what we have here," he slurred, his voice a foul stain on the evening air. "The silent little bird, left all alone in her cage. Harland finally get tired of you?" Eleanor stood her ground, her hand tightening on the handle of the feed bucket. She could not hear his words, but she could read the malice on his lips and in his eyes. Billy took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Tully, you should go. Mr. Harland will be back soon." Tully shot the boy a look of contempt. "Stay out of this, boy, or I'll tan your hide." He turned his attention back to Eleanor, taking another step closer. The smell of stale whiskey reached her, a sour, cloying scent. He lifted his free hand and made a grotesque, mocking gesture near his ear, mimicking her deafness. "What's the matter? Can't you hear me? Or are you just too good to talk to the likes of me?" He lunged, his hand shooting out to grab her arm. Eleanor reacted without thinking. She swung the heavy wooden feed bucket, catching him square in the chest. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and he staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. He dropped his whiskey bottle, which shattered on the hard-packed earth. His surprise quickly curdled into rage. "Why, you little—" he snarled, and came at her again. Eleanor backed away toward the porch, her eyes darting around for a weapon. Her gaze fell upon the stiff-bristled broom she had left leaning against the wall. As Tully reached for her, she grabbed the broom and swung it with all her might, the end of the handle cracking sharply against his shoulder. He howled in pain and fury. Stumbling backward, she held the broom in front of her like a spear, her knuckles white, her expression fierce. She was not a frightened victim. She was a woman defending her home. For a long moment, Tully just stood there, breathing heavily, rubbing his shoulder. He looked from the defiant woman to the nervous boy watching from the barn, and his face contorted with humiliation. He had been bested by a deaf woman and a boy. His eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice low and venomous. He pointed a trembling finger at her. "You and your husband, you'll both regret this." He turned, climbed clumsily onto his horse, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and threats hanging in the air. When Cole returned the next afternoon, he knew something was wrong the moment he rode into the yard. Billy met him with a pale, worried face, and Eleanor was standing on the porch, her posture unnaturally rigid. He dismounted, his eyes scanning the yard, noticing the shattered glass near the chicken coop. He looked from Billy to Eleanor, a silent question in his eyes. Billy told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. As the boy spoke, Cole's face slowly hardened, transforming from weathered granite into something far more dangerous. The muscles in his jaw clenched and unclenched. A muscle twitched beside his eye. When Billy finished, Cole stood perfectly still for a long moment, an unnerving calm settling over him. Then he turned without a word and started walking toward the barn where his fastest horse was stabled. His movements were deliberate, economical, and filled with a lethal purpose. Eleanor knew. She knew exactly what he intended to do. She ran after him, grabbing his arm just as he reached for a saddle. He did not even look at her, trying to shake her off. She held on, her grip surprisingly strong. When he refused to look at her, she moved in front of him, blocking his path. She stood before him, a small, unmovable object in the path of his towering rage. She looked up into his face, into the storm she saw brewing in his pale gray eyes. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against the hard wall of his chest. She could feel the furious pounding of his heart beneath her hand. She met his gaze, and with her other hand, she made a sharp, definitive gesture. No. Then she simply shook her head, a slow, deliberate motion, her eyes pleading with him. He stared down at her, his whole body rigid with the need for violence, for vengeance. He wanted to ride to the Tully place and drag the man out of his house. He wanted to make him pay for touching her, for frightening her, for violating the sanctity of their home. The rage was a white-hot fire in his veins, demanding an outlet. But her touch, her calm, her silent plea, it was like water on the fire. It did not extinguish it completely, but it contained it, banked it. He saw not fear in her eyes, but a deep, resonant strength. She was not asking him to be her avenger. She was asking him to be her husband, to stay with her, to not let another man's evil poison what they had built. Her calm disarmed his fury in a way no words ever could. He closed his eyes for a moment, his breath coming out in a long, ragged sigh. The tension slowly drained from his shoulders. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and the storm in them had passed. He placed his hand over hers on his chest, a silent acknowledgement. He would stay. That night, their bond, which had been forged in shared solitude and tested by mockery, was tempered into something unbreakable. After their silent meal, Eleanor went to the small wooden chest where she kept her few personal belongings. She returned with something held carefully in her hands. She stood before him and held it out. It was a small carving, whittled from a piece of cottonwood. It was his likeness. She had captured him perfectly, the broad set of his shoulders, the slight tilt of his head, the stubborn line of his jaw. But it was the eyes that made him speechless. With nothing more than a small knife and a piece of wood, she had carved the weariness and the sorrow he kept hidden from the world, but also the quiet strength he held in reserve. She had not just carved the man the world saw, she had carved his soul. Cole took the carving from her, his large hands trembling slightly. He stared at it, turning it over and over, his throat too tight to speak. That she saw him, truly saw him, with such clarity and understanding, was a revelation that struck him to the core. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a raw, unguarded emotion she had never seen before. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was a gesture of profound tenderness, a question and a statement all in one. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a moment, giving her silent consent. He led her by the hand to his room, a place she had never entered. He lit a single lamp, which cast a soft, golden glow over the simple space. There were no words. There was no need for them. Their entire relationship had been a prelude to this, a long, slow journey toward a moment of perfect, silent understanding. He undressed her slowly, with a reverence that made her feel cherished, not exposed. His hands, which could be so rough and powerful, were impossibly gentle. She, in turn, unbuttoned his shirt, her fingers tracing the hard muscles of his chest, the faint, silvery lines of old scars. When they finally came together in his bed, it was a quiet, tender collision of two lonely souls. It was not a desperate, frantic act, but a slow, sensual discovery, a conversation spoken through touch and breath and the meeting of eyes in the dim light. It was a raw and deeply human expression of the love that had grown between them, nurtured in silence, and it was more eloquent than any poem ever spoken aloud. The next morning, they lay tangled in the sheets as the pale dawn light crept through the window. The air was different, charged with a new intimacy. Cole was propped up on one elbow, watching her, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. He hesitated. Then he began to speak, his voice low and raspy in the morning quiet. He told her about his past, the story pouring out of him now that the dam of his solitude had been broken. He told her about Sarah, the woman he was supposed to marry years ago. He told her how they had built this house together, how she had planted the lilac bush by the porch that had long since died. He told her about the baby, a son, and how something had gone wrong. He had lost them both, mother and child, on the same cold winter night. "I swore I'd never love again," he whispered, his eyes filled with the ghosts of that old pain. "I swore I'd never let anyone get close enough to hurt me like that again." Eleanor listened, her heart aching for the pain he had carried alone for so long. She saw the deep wounds that had shaped him into the hard, silent man he was. When he finished, she reached for the slate she had brought in from the kitchen the night before. She picked up the chalk, and in the soft morning light, she wrote a single, steady line. She held it up for him to see. "You already love again, you just don't hear it." Cole read the words, and his breath hitched. He looked from the slate to her face, and he saw the profound, unwavering truth in her eyes. She understood. She knew that love was not a grand declaration, but a quiet, steady thing, a shared meal, a clumsy gesture, a hand on his chest in a moment of rage, a carving that saw into his very soul. He reached for his trousers, draped over a chair nearby, and took a folded piece of paper from the pocket. He handed her the paper and the chalk. She wrote the words again, this time on the paper. He took it from her, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his shirt. He placed his hand over the spot, keeping the words, and the woman who wrote them, safe and close to his heart. The summer that followed their union was not one of gentle growth, but of slow, creeping death. The rains, which should have come in May and June, never arrived. The sky remained a vast, indifferent sheet of pale, hazy blue. The sun, once a life-giving force, became a malevolent tyrant, beating down on the plains with a relentless, baking heat. The grasses turned from green to gold, then from gold to a brittle, lifeless brown. The earth cracked open in a network of deep, thirsty fissures. The once mighty Clearwater River shrank to a muddy, sluggish trickle. A drought had seized the land in its fist and was slowly squeezing the life from it. For the ranchers of Clearwater Ridge, it was a disaster. Cattle grew thin, their ribs stark beneath their hides, their lowing a constant, mournful plea for water. Tensions in the county, already simmering with gossip and petty grievance, began to boil over. Men who had once been neighbors now eyed each other with suspicion over watering rights and grazing land. The air was thick not just with dust, but with desperation. The Harland Ranch suffered along with the rest. Cole's face grew leaner, the lines around his eyes deeper. He worked tirelessly, hauling water from their steadily dropping well, his body a taut wire of anxiety. One evening, he came to Eleanor as she stood on the porch, watching the heat lightning flicker silently on the distant horizon. He took her slate and wrote, "The grazing is gone. I have to drive the strongest of the herd north to the Bighorn foothills. There's still grass there. It's the only chance." Eleanor looked up at him, her heart sinking. The Bighorns were a week's ride away. He would be gone for weeks, maybe more than a month. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the worry of leaving her alone. She took the chalk from him and wrote a single word, "Go." Then she put her hand on his arm, a gesture of unwavering support. This was their life, their ranch. His struggle was her struggle. He covered her hand with his own and nodded. The matter settled. He left 2 days later at dawn, with Jed and half the herd. He kissed her before he left, a firm, lingering press of his lips to hers that was both a promise and a prayer. He left her and Billy to manage what remained of the ranch, the horses, a few milk cows, and the weakest of the cattle he'd left behind. As she watched him ride away, a silhouette against the blood-red sunrise, a profound sense of responsibility settled over her. He had trusted her with their home. She would not fail him. For 2 weeks, a tense peace held. Eleanor and Billy worked in a seamless, silent partnership, their days governed by the needs of the thirsty animals. But Eleanor felt a constant, prickling unease. She had seen Frank Tully in town the week before Cole left, his eyes lingering on her with a look of undiluted venom. The memory of his threat had not faded. Her fears were realized on a blistering afternoon in the 3rd week of Cole's absence. She was in the barn, forking hay into the stalls, when she felt a deep, rhythmic vibration through the soles of her boots. It was the thunder of approaching horses, moving too fast to be friendly. Billy was out mending a fence on the far side of the property. She was alone. She crept to the crack in the large barn doors and peered out. Her blood ran cold. Frank Tully and 2 other men were riding hard toward the horse corral. They were not paying a social call. They carried ropes, and their intent was as clear as the merciless sky above. With cattle prices plummeting, good horses were the most valuable things on any ranch, and Cole's stock was famous in the county. Tully was there to settle his score and make a profit at the same time. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her for a second. She was one woman against 3 armed men. But then, the image of Cole's face at sunrise, the feel of his kiss, the weight of his trust, flooded her mind. This was her home. Panic gave way to a cold, clear resolve. She darted to the small tack room where Cole kept his hunting rifle mounted on the wall. She had watched him clean it 100 times, had learned the smooth, efficient motions of his hands. Her own hands, though trembling, moved with purpose. She took down the heavy Winchester, its wooden stock smooth and cool against her skin. She found the box of cartridges, her fingers fumbling slightly as she slid a shell into the chamber. The metallic click, a small, definitive sound in the quiet barn. She was terrified, but her fear was a tool now, honing her senses to a razor's edge. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft, the rifle heavy in her arms. From the high loft door, she had a clear view of the corral. Tully and his men had dismounted and were trying to force the gate, their movements hurried and furtive. The horses, sensing the men's malice, were agitated, circling the enclosure with wide, terrified eyes. Eleanor rested the barrel of the rifle on the edge of the loft door, taking a steadying breath. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She did not want to kill anyone. She just wanted them to leave. She aimed high, toward the top of the corral fence, well away from any of the men. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with a force that nearly knocked her over. The sound, she knew, must have been deafening. Outside, the men froze, their heads snapping up toward the barn. One of them shouted something, pointing at the loft. Tully recovered first, a look of furious disbelief on his face. "It's just the deaf woman," she saw him yell. "She can't hit the broadside of this barn. Get the gate." One of the other men, emboldened by Tully's words, ran to the gate and began to wrestle with the latch. Eleanor knew a second shot was necessary. This time she aimed at the wooden water trough just outside the corral. She fired again. The bullet struck the trough with a tremendous crack, sending a shower of splinters and a spray of precious water into the air. That was when the chaos erupted. The loud noise and splintering wood sent the already panicked horses into a frenzy. They bolted, crashing against the corral fence. The man at the gate, whose name was Henderson, yelped in fear and stumbled backward, right into the path of a crazed stallion. The horse struck him with its shoulder, sending him sprawling to the ground. He cried out, clutching his leg, his face twisted in pain. Seeing one of his men down and the horses now an uncontrollable, dangerous stampede, Tully's nerve finally broke. He and the other man grabbed the injured Henderson, hauled him onto his horse, and fled, casting furious, hate-filled looks back at the silent, imposing barn. Eleanor stayed in the loft, the heavy rifle resting on her lap, until they were nothing more than a smudge of dust on the horizon. Only then did the adrenaline drain away, leaving her shaking so violently she could barely stand. She had done it. She had defended their home. The town's reaction was swift and merciless. The injured man, Henderson, had a broken leg. The story Frank Tully told was a masterpiece of lies and half-truths. He claimed they had just been riding by to check on a stray calf when the deaf woman, crazed and hysterical, had started shooting at them for no reason. She had spooked the horses, causing Henderson's injury. The town, already steeped in prejudice and primed by gossip, readily believed him. The whispers that had once followed Eleanor now became a roar of condemnation. A delegation, led by the sheriff and Mr. Gable from the general store, rode out to the ranch the next day. The sheriff, a man named Potter, was blunt. "A woman like you has no business with a firearm," he said, his words slow and patronizing, as if she were a child. "It's a miracle you did not kill someone." The other men nodded in agreement, their faces a mixture of fear and sanctimony. They saw her not as a courageous woman, but as a dangerous liability. The fact that she was defending her own property against thieves was lost in their judgment of her disability. A deaf woman with a gun was, to them, an unnatural and terrifying thing. Cole returned 3 days later to a vandalized ranch. In the night, someone had cut his fences and painted cruel words on his barn. He found Eleanor in the house, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes held a fire he had never seen before. She was shaken, but she was not broken. When she told him what had happened, writing furiously on her slate, he listened in a dead, chilling silence. That evening, the town held a meeting in the schoolhouse to discuss the Harland problem. Cole walked in just as Frank Tully was finishing his self-serving, fictional account of the incident. The room was packed, the air thick with righteous indignation. All eyes turned to Cole as he entered, Eleanor walking steadily behind him. He ignored them all, his gaze fixed on Tully. "You're a liar and a horse thief." "Tully," Cole said, his voice dangerously quiet. Sheriff Potter stepped forward. "Now, Cole, let's be civil. There are folks here who are rightly concerned. Your wife was reckless." "My wife was defending our home," Cole cut in, his voice rising, silencing the sheriff. He turned and faced the crowd, his eyes sweeping over their hostile, judgmental faces. He saw the Gables, the women who had mocked Eleanor in the store, the men who had laughed at her on the saloon porch. "I know what all of you have been saying," he began, his voice ringing with a power they had never heard from him. "I know you've been whispering about my wife since the day she arrived." He took a step forward, his gaze locking with men in the front row. "You laughed when the deaf bride arrived." He let the words hang in the air, a stark and ugly accusation. A murmur went through the room, faces flushing with shame and defiance. You looked at her and you saw something broken, something to be pitied or mocked. You saw a woman who could not hear you, and you thought that made her less than you. He paused, his eyes finding Eleanor's for a brief second before turning back to the crowd. You were wrong. I have spent my life around people who talk too much and say nothing. People like all of you. My wife, in her silence, has more courage, more strength, and more honor than this entire town put together. He pointed a finger at Frank Tully. She stood up to this coward and his friends when they came to steal from her. She did what any one of you would pray your own wives would have the courage to do. And for that, you dare to judge her? His voice dropped again, but it was filled with a cold, hard conviction that was more powerful than any shout. She is better than all of you. Absolute silence fell over the room. No one moved. No one spoke. The townspeople of Clearwater Ridge, for the first time, were forced to see the woman they had scorned through Cole Harlan's eyes. They saw not a broken object of pity, but a woman of formidable strength, defended by a man whose love for her was as fierce and uncompromising as the land itself. Eleanor, who had been standing just behind him, placed her hand on his shoulder. He reached up and covered it with his own. She was trembling, but her head was held high, her eyes shining with pride. They stood together, a silent, unbreachable fortress against the town's prejudice. That night, back in the quiet safety of their home, their love for each other was a palpable thing. They came together not with the passionate discovery of their first night, but with a slow, profound gratitude. They were two survivors who had faced down mockery and fire and had come through stronger. Their bodies spoke a language of comfort and solace, a testament to the battle they had won, a reaffirmation of the world they had built together in the face of so much hate. It was a healing, a quiet celebration of their shared soul. A few days later, Cole sat on the porch, working with his knife. The drought had claimed one of their finest bulls, a magnificent creature whose loss had been a heavy blow. Now, Cole held one of its horns in his hand, the polished black surface gleaming in the sun. For hours, he carved and sanded, his movements patient and precise. When he was finished, he came to Eleanor and took her hand. He opened his palm, and lying there was a simple, dark ring, polished so smooth it felt like silk. It was beautiful, a perfect circle of midnight black carved from the heart of their hardship. He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then he took her other hand and held it, looking directly into her eyes, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. He spoke slowly, making sure she could read his lips. His voice a soft promise meant only for her. I will never let them silence you. The first sign of hope came not as a cloud, but as a scent. After months of dry, choking dust, a new fragrance rode the wind one afternoon, a deep, earthy smell of damp soil and ozone. Eleanor stood on the porch, her face turned to the sky, and watched as the horizon to the west turned from a pale, hazy blue to a deep, bruised purple. The clouds, which had been absent for so long, returned like a gathering army, their bellies heavy with rain. When the first drop fell, it landed on the dusty porch rail with a small, distinct puff, then another and another. Within minutes, a steady drizzle had begun, and the drizzle became a downpour. It was a deluge, a biblical flood that hammered on the tin roof of the house and turned the dusty yard into a sea of churning mud. It was the most beautiful thing Eleanor had ever seen. The land, parched and dying, drank with a desperate thirst. Hope, which had withered to a brittle thing, began to swell and green again in the hearts of the people. The rain continued for 2 days, a steady, soaking gift from the heavens. On the third day, the downpour eased, and Cole rode out to check on the herd and the far fences. The cattle, weak but revived by the water, had begun to wander, seeking the new shoots of grass that were already pushing through the softened earth. He told Eleanor he would be back before dusk. his smile easy for the first time in months. The drought was broken. The worst was over. But the rain that brought life back to the land also gave cover to the evil that festered in a dark corner of the county. Frank Tully had not forgotten his humiliation. Cole's speech at the town meeting had made him a laughingstock, and his hatred had curdled into a venomous obsession. He saw Cole ride out alone, and he saw his chance. Cole was driving a small group of strays back from the southern pasture, near the edge of a deep, rock-strewn canyon, when they came for him. Tully and the brother of the man whose leg had been broken, a hulking brute named Silas Henderson. They emerged from a cluster of rock outcroppings, rifles raised. Cole's hand instantly went to the pistol on his hip, but he was exposed, a single rider in the open. "This is for my brother, Harland!" Silas yelled, his voice a raw bellow of rage. Cole didn't waste time with words. He spurred his horse, Apollo, dropping low in the saddle as the first shot cracked through the damp air, whining past his ear. He fired back, his shot going wide as the horse scrambled for purchase on the muddy ground. He was a formidable fighter, but he was one man against two, and they had the advantage of surprise and position. He wheeled Apollo around a large boulder, using it for cover, and managed to get a clear shot at Silas. The big man grunted and clutched his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. But as Cole aimed for Tully, a searing, white-hot pain exploded in his own side. Tully's shot had found its mark. The force of the bullet knocked him from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, the world tilting and spinning. He tried to push himself up, to reach for his gun, but his limbs would not obey. Through a darkening haze, he saw Frank Tully standing over him, a triumphant, demonic sneer on his face. Then, with a final, brutal kick to his wounded side, Tully sent him rolling over the edge of the canyon. Cole felt a moment of weightlessness, a blur of sky and rock, before the world went black. Back at the ranch, Eleanor went about her evening chores, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The air was clean and cool, and the soundless world around her seemed vibrant with new life. But as the sun began to sink, painting the wet clouds in hues of orange and rose, a knot of unease began to tighten in her stomach. He should have been back by now. She was standing on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron and scanning the horizon, when she saw him, a lone horse, galloping hard, its saddle empty. It was Apollo. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, pierced her. The horse did not stop until it reached the corral, its sides heaving, its coat slick with sweat and rain. Its reins were broken, and there was a dark, ugly scrape along its flank. There was no sign of Cole. Billy came running from the bunkhouse, his face a mask of alarm. He saw the empty saddle and looked at Eleanor, his eyes wide with a question he was too scared to ask. But Eleanor was already moving. Her calm was a terrifying thing. There was no panic, no hysteria, only a chilling, focused certainty. She strode to the barn, grabbed a bridle, and approached her own mare, a steady-tempered horse named Bess. Her movements were swift and efficient. She was not a wife waiting for news. She was a rescuer on a mission. "Mrs. Harland, you cannot—" Billy stammered, running after her. "It is getting dark. The storm. You should wait for the sheriff." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes blazing with an intensity that stopped him in his tracks. She placed a hand on his shoulder and looked directly into his eyes, her expression leaving no room for argument. She pointed to the house, then to the rifle on the wall, then to him. "Stay. Protect the house." Then she swung herself up onto Bess's bare back, grabbing a fistful of mane, and urged the horse into a gallop, following the tracks of Cole's riderless horse back the way it had come. She rode into the gathering gloom, the world around her a landscape of gray shadows and rising mist. The rain started again, a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked her thin dress and chilled her to the bone. She trusted the horse. Letting Bess follow the trail her instincts screamed was the right one. She scanned the ground, her eyes sharp, searching for any sign, a dropped hat, a broken branch, anything. She found him an hour later. It was Apollo's tracks, veering sharply near the canyon's edge, and the scuffed, churned mud of a struggle that drew her eye. She dismounted, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She crept to the edge of the ravine and peered down, and she saw him. He was a crumpled shape at the bottom, wedged between two large, slick rocks, half submerged in the muddy water that was now rushing through the canyon floor. For a terrible, endless second, she thought he was dead. Then she saw a slight movement, a twitch of a hand. She did not know how she got down the treacherous slope. She half climbed, half slid, scraping her hands raw on the sharp rocks, her skirt tearing on thorny bushes. By the time she reached him, she was covered in mud and bleeding from a dozen small cuts. He was barely conscious, his face ashen, his lips tinged with blue. His eyes were open but unfocused, clouded with delirium and pain. A dark stain was spreading across his shirt from a wound in his side. He was mumbling, his mouth forming words she could not understand. She pressed her fingers to his neck and felt a pulse, faint and thready. But there, he was alive. The knowledge galvanized her. She could not leave him here. The rising water would drown him. She had to get him out. She looked up at the slick, muddy slope she had just descended. It looked like a sheer cliff, an impossible obstacle. But she did not allow herself to think of it as impossible. It was simply what had to be done. She looped her arms under his, trying to pull him. He was a dead weight, a mountain of a man, and she was a small woman. Her first attempt was a failure. She slipped in the mud, her feet finding no purchase, and they both slid back. Despair, cold and black, threatened to overwhelm her. She looked at his face, at the man who had defended her, who had smiled at her in a storm, who had kept her words close to his heart. Never. The words she had mouthed to him echoed in her mind. She set her jaw, a wave of primal strength surging through her. She would not let him die. She tried again, this time digging her bare heels into the soft earth. Using rocks and exposed roots as handholds, she hauled him, inch by agonizing inch, up the muddy slope. It was a brutal, grueling ascent. She pulled, she slipped. She dug her bleeding fingers into the earth and pulled again. She wrapped a piece of her torn dress around his wound, a futile attempt to stem the bleeding. She whispered to him, soundless prayers and words of encouragement that were nothing but puffs of air against his cold cheek. Come on, Cole, stay with me, please, stay with me. The rain intensified, plastering her hair to her face and turning the slope into a river of mud. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest. Her lungs burned, her vision blurred with exhaustion. At one point, a brilliant fork of lightning split the sky, illuminating the canyon in a stark, momentary flash. It lit her face, a mask of mud and tears. Her features contorted with a fierce, almost terrifying determination as she hauled the broken body of her husband toward home. She was no longer just a woman. She was a force of nature, her love a fire that refused to be extinguished by the storm. Somehow, she reached the top. Somehow, she managed to get his unconscious form draped over the back of her patient mare. The journey home was a waking nightmare. She walked beside the horse, one hand on Cole to keep him from sliding off, the other gripping the mane, letting the animal guide her through the dark. When she finally stumbled into the ranch yard, she was near collapse. Billy, who had been keeping a frantic vigil, ran to help her. Together, they managed to get Cole into the house and onto his bed. The boy's face was white with shock at the sight of Cole's wound and Eleanor's own ravaged state. For the next 3 days, Eleanor did not sleep. She lived in a twilight world of fever and fear. Her entire existence narrowed to the man lying in the bed. She cut away his blood-soaked shirt and saw the ugly, inflamed bullet wound with shaking hands. She cleaned it as best she could with whiskey and hot water. She probed the wound with a sterilized knife until she found the bullet and drew it out. A small, misshapen piece of lead that had nearly cost him his life. She stitched the wound closed with a needle and thread from her sewing kit, her stitches small and neat despite the trembling of her hands. She fought the fever that consumed him, bathing his sweat-soaked body with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of broth and willow bark tea between his cracked lips. She sat by his bed, watching the shallow rise and fall of his chest, her hand often resting on his, willing her own strength into him. Billy brought her food and coffee, but she barely noticed it. She was a sentinel, a guardian, and she would not rest until the danger had passed. On the morning of the 4th day, the fever broke. His breathing deepened, and the frantic, restless edge to his sleep finally calmed. Eleanor, watching him, felt a wave of relief so profound it almost brought her to her knees. The exhaustion she had been holding at bay for days came crashing down on her. Her head grew heavy. Her eyelids felt like lead weights. She slumped forward in her chair, her head coming to rest on the edge of his bed, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Sometime later, Cole woke. The haze of fever and pain had lifted, leaving behind a dull ache and a profound weakness. The first thing he saw was the pale light of morning filtering through the window. The second thing he saw was Eleanor. She was collapsed in the chair beside him, her head pillowed on her arms on the mattress, just inches from his hand. Her face, even in sleep, was etched with exhaustion. There were dark, bruised circles under her eyes. Her hair was a tangled mess, and he could see the dried blood under her fingernails and the raw scrapes on her hands. He saw the torn, mud-stained dress she still wore. He saw what she had done. She had walked through fire and flood to save him. A feeling of love so fierce and overwhelming it was almost painful constricted his chest. He lifted his hand, an act that took a surprising amount of effort, and gently stroked her cheek. Her skin was soft, smudged with dirt. His throat was raw, his lips dry. He tried to speak, but only a rough croak emerged. He cleared his throat and tried again, mouthing the words he needed her to understand, his voice a ragged whisper. "Don't leave me." At his touch, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him, her gaze clouded with sleep for a moment, then clearing into sharp, brilliant focus. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a sunrise after a long night. She did not need to write her answer. She lifted her hand and pressed her palm flat against his heart, a gesture that had become their sacred language. She felt the slow, steady beat beneath her hand, the proof that he was alive, that he was with her. She leaned in close, her eyes holding his, and she mouthed a single, silent word, a promise that sealed their souls together forever. Never. The seasons turned, each one a testament to the land's resilience and their own. Winter came, blanketing the plains in a deep, silent layer of white, and Cole's wound healed into a puckered, angry scar. When the spring thaw arrived, it became clear that the bullet had left its permanent mark. He walked with a limp, a slight, uneven gait that favored his left side. It was a constant, physical reminder of his brush with death, a small price paid for his life. At first, it frustrated him, this new limitation on a body that had never failed him. But Eleanor's presence was a steadying balm. She never treated him as if he were diminished. They simply found a new rhythm, a new way to work together. They rebuilt the ranch side by side. He taught her how to string barbed wire, his large hands guiding her smaller ones, their movements economical and sure. She, in turn, showed him the quiet patience of her garden, which she expanded, its neat rows a vibrant splash of green against the brown earth. They were a partnership in every sense of the word. Where his strength now had limits, her endurance filled the gap. When a task required a steady hand, his was there. Their life was a quiet, intricate dance of shared labor and unspoken understanding. The ranch, once a place of stark, lonely survival, was now a place of thriving, shared life. The story of how Eleanor had dragged her dying husband from the bottom of a canyon and nursed him back to life had spread through Clearwater Ridge like a prairie fire. It was a tale of grit and devotion so profound that it slowly began to erode the foundations of the town's prejudice. The narrative had shifted. She was no longer the deaf mail-order bride. She was the woman who had saved Cole Harland. The change was not sudden, but it was real. It began with the children. They would see her in town and, their minds unburdened by their parents' narrow judgments, would offer small, shy waves. Eleanor, at first surprised, would return the gesture with a brilliant smile that transformed her face. And soon the children sought her out, their curiosity pure and open. Then, a few of the women began to thaw. One day, Martha Potter, the sheriff's wife, approached Eleanor outside the general store. Her face was flushed with a mixture of shame and determination. She held up her hands in a gesture of helplessness, and then pointed to Eleanor's, her expression a clear, unspoken question. Eleanor understood. She spent 10 minutes on the dusty boardwalk, patiently teaching the sheriff's wife the simple, graceful signs for good morning and thank you. It was a small beginning, a crack in the wall of ignorance, but it was a start. Soon, 2 or 3 other women would approach her, asking for a word here, a phrase there. They were clumsy, but they were trying. For the first time, people were attempting to cross the divide into her world, instead of simply demanding she exist in theirs. By the time summer returned, bringing with it the annual town fair, the atmosphere in Clearwater Ridge was fundamentally different. The fair was a celebration of the end of the drought, a day of games and food and communal relief. Cole and Eleanor attended, not as outcasts, but as respected members of the community. He walked with his slight limp, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and people nodded to them, their greetings genuine. They were watching a horse-pulling contest when a familiar, ugly voice cut through the cheerful noise of the crowd. "Well, looky here, if it ain't the miracle worker and her pet." Eleanor turned to see a man swaggering toward them. He had the same cruel eyes and sneering mouth as Frank Tully. It was his brother, Jedediah, a man who had been away working for the railroad and had only recently returned to town, his heart just as full of poison as his brother's had been. Frank was long gone, having fled the county after the ambush, but his legacy of hate remained. Jedediah Tully stopped in front of them, his gaze dripping with contempt. He ignored Cole and focused entirely on Eleanor. He began to make crude, exaggerated motions with his hands, a grotesque and insulting parody of her sign language. "What's the matter, Harland?" he taunted, his eyes on Cole. "Cat got her tongue? Oh, that's right. She ain't got one that works." A hush fell over the people nearby. The laughter and conversation died as they turned to watch. Cole's body went rigid. The pleasant, relaxed man of a moment ago vanished, replaced by a figure of cold, coiled fury. The scar on his side seemed to pulse. He took a half-step forward, his hands clenching into fists, every line of his body radiating a lethal intent. He was ready to finish what had started at the canyon. But before he could take another step, a gentle pressure on his arm stopped him. He looked down. It was Eleanor. She stood beside him, her expression serene, and slowly, deliberately shook her head. Her eyes, clear and steady, met his. "No, let me." She released his arm and turned to face Jedediah Tully, who was still smirking, enjoying the spectacle he had created. She did not look at him with anger or fear. She looked at him with a calm, unwavering pity that seemed to unnerve him more than any threat could have. Then, she lifted her hands and addressed not him, but the silent, watching crowd. Her hands moved with a fluid, articulate grace that was breathtaking to watch. The gestures were clean, precise, and filled with a power that transcended sound. She formed the signs for 3 simple words, a statement that was both a defense and a declaration of her very being. Silence is not weakness. The crowd was utterly still. No one coughed. No one shuffled their feet. In the absolute quiet, they watched her hands speak a truth that landed with the force of a physical blow. For the first time, they were not just seeing her gestures, they were hearing her voice. And in that moment, the last vestiges of their prejudice crumbled to dust. They no longer saw a broken woman, an object of pity or scorn. They saw Eleanor Harland, whole and radiant, a woman of immense strength who had forged her own language, her own power. Out of the silence they had so long feared. She was not defined by what she lacked. She was defined by what she was. Cole watched her, and his heart swelled with a pride so fierce it brought a glistening sheen to his eyes. The rage had vanished, replaced by an overwhelming love and awe for the woman standing beside him. He looked out at the faces in the crowd, at the dawning understanding in their eyes, and he knew they finally saw what he had seen all along. His voice, when he spoke, was loud and clear, ringing across the fairgrounds, not as a defense, but as a cheer, a triumphant confirmation of the truth she had just shown them. She is better than all of you. For a beat, there was silence. Then, one person began to clap, then another and another, until the entire crowd erupted in a wave of thunderous applause and cheers. They were not cheering out of pity for a poor, deaf woman. They were cheering with genuine, heartfelt respect for a hero, for a neighbor, for one of their own. They were cheering for Eleanor. As dusk began to settle, casting long, peaceful shadows across the plains, they stood on the porch of their ranch. The distant, happy noise of the fair had faded, replaced by the gentle sigh of the evening wind. The world was quiet, saturated in the soft, golden light of the setting sun. Cole's hand was entwined with hers, the carved horn ring on her finger cool and solid against his skin. Eleanor looked out at the vast, sweeping horizon, at the endless sea of grass that was no longer a symbol of loneliness, but of peace and belonging. She looked at the sturdy house, the strong fences, the thriving garden. She looked at the man standing beside her, his presence a warm, solid anchor in her silent world. She squeezed his hand and, with her free one, she lifted it and made a simple sign, a circle drawn over her heart. Home. Cole looked down at her, a soft, gentle smile touching his lips. He reached out and touched her cheek, his thumb stroking the curve of her jaw. He leaned in, his voice a low, soft murmur meant only for her, the words a perfect echo of her heart. Yes, home. The wind swept across the plains, rustling the new leaves on the lilac bush she had planted by the porch. It carried with it the distant sound of laughter from the town. But it was different now. It was not the cruel, mocking sound she had first been greeted with, but something warm and inclusive, a sound that belonged to a community she was finally a part of. The silence between them was no longer an empty chasm, a space of things unsaid. It was full. It was a shared language, a quiet understanding, a deep and abiding love that needed no words at all to be heard. Thank you so much for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.